and has reconnected us again. My name is William Baloyi from GCIS, heading the media engagement of government. I would be the one that will be facilitating this program. Let me quickly first check if we have all our panelists. Themba, can you do a roll call? From my side, I can see Themba, I can see Ms.
William, James is back here.
Ms. Monique Leroux is here.
Welcome back, colleagues.
McKay is here.
It was simpler to join now. Thanks, Dr. Nduli. I think
Dr. Mduli, we see you now. You can take your position
now.
Josiah Themba, do we have Mr. Vali Padayachi and Ms. Isabel Fick? The two are outstanding. Jos, do we have Ms. Isabel and Mr. Vali Padayachi, because they are actually at the top of the running order? No. I'm not sure if I'm audible to the background team. Jos, Themba, do we have Ms. Isabel Fick and Mr. Vali Padayachi? Are they yet connected?
You want to repeat that, Mr. Baloyi? Was off.
Jos, can I hear you?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I think the voice is clear. Themba is coming to rename your account there.
Yeah, no, I'm checking if we have Ms. Isabel Fick and also Mr. Vali Padayachi, because on the running order, we start with them.
Yeah.
Before we go to Professor Young.
Yeah. We will need to just rearrange. Mr. McKay has some appointments. If we, after yourself, Mr. McKay, would you want to come after the system operator or just beforehand?
Mine is not a technical presentation. It's more of a sort of a scene setting. So, William, I'm happy to go either up front, set the scene, or after the system operator, whatever you would prefer me to do.
Okay. All right then. Chair, you'll guide us. But
is the system operator here?
I'm trying to locate her on the chat so that I can promote her.
I see Ms. Daphne Mukwena.
Yes, she says she's connected, Chair. So Isabel.
I think she's not visible on my system.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, then she is. No. She's there as Speak. I think it's her surname. Yeah, I've promoted her. She should be joining us.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to welcome all the panelists. My name is William Baloyi, as I've said. I would be facilitating this webinar. Unfortunately, one of my colleagues who was initially supposed to facilitate, Tasneem, is still engaged in other parallel processes that we are having. We are quite involved with the BRICS issues, and the I've just got an indication that one of the broadcasters will be taking this live as we go. So immediately we start, know that we will be live. So the speaker that will be on the platform, make sure that your video is on. And here is going to be the running order. We will start with Ms. Isabel Fick, the ESCOM General Manager, System Operator. I am not going to take much of the time in introducing the panelists' background, but the panelists might just touch in 30 seconds their background. And from there on, we will quickly then go to Mr. James McKay, who was supposed to be the CEO of Energy Council of South Africa. Then from there on, we'll then follow the running order of the chairperson of the NRS Association, Mr. Vali Padayaji. I see you have joined. Thank you very much and welcome. Then also we'll go to Professor Jan de Kock and Dr. Sipho Mdluli. And the last one will be Ms. Monique Leroux. The time that we agreed on was the initial time is that the system operator would have close to 20 minutes maximum. And Mr. James McKay, 10, and the other speakers, it will be 10 minutes, 10 minutes. And from there on, we'll then take questions and reflections from the attendees of the webinar. I'm not sure if it's fine, it's in order.
That's perfect, Chair. Just if the background team can make sure that we've got access to put up slides to share.
Oh, thank you very much. The background team, I'm not sure JCIS or Temba would make sure that the slides are visible.
Yeah, I can confirm, a facilitator, every member of the panelists will be able to share their screen and also their presentations. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Daphne, I see your hand is up.
Yes, Chair, there's a request that we can we actually record the session or the webinar?
I'm not sure if any of the panelists have any problem with that.
Yes.
I'm happy. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. I take it that is the total agreement and feeling that it can be recorded. On that note, let me thank you very much, panelists. Then we would switch on and get into the main webinar. System of, Temba, JCIS, we can get into the main webinar now.
Yeah, we can start, Mr. Baloyi, sure.
Thank you very much and good morning. Today on the 19th of July, the year of 2023. My name is William Baloyi from the Government Communication and Information Services. I would be facilitating this webinar. What is it all about? The webinar is about the myths and facts about the electricity grid stability. The unintended consequences of higher stages has given rise to perception of an imminent national electricity or power grid collapse or a blackout. The primary purpose of this webinar is to create awareness and share insights with public on the country's power grid. The power grid is a critical asset of the country. It enables an effective integration of diverse energy sources. It promotes grid stability and resilience and provides economic benefits to the country by facilitating electricity trading. The ESCOM system operator is responsible for the reliability and security of the South African national grid by monitoring, controlling, and operating it in a safe, economical, and reliable manner. Sadly, when the demand of electricity is higher than what Eskom can generate, it is necessary to reduce demand by turning off electricity supply to certain areas in the country for a specified period. Higher stages of load shedding do not necessarily increase the risk of a blackout. Rather, they reflect the continued ability of the system operator to manage the balanced power system and balance supply with demand. To that end, as government communication services and information services, we have invited speakers of high caliber that will be giving us more insight into that. In the list of speakers that we have, of course, from Eskom, the system operator, Ms. Isabel Fick, who would be the opening act on this webinar. We then also have, she will be followed by Mr. James McKay, who is the CEO of the Energy Council of South Africa. We'll then have Mr. Vali Padayachi. Mr. Vali Padayachi is the CEO of National Rationalized Specifications Association of South Africa. We also have Professor Jan de Kock, who is the president of South African Institute of Electrical Engineering. We have also Dr. Sipho Mdluli, principal researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And lastly, we'll be having also Ms. Monique Leroux, who is a senior researcher and electrical engineer also with the CSIR Energy Center. Welcome and thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this webinar. To kickstart the discussion, we would then invite Ms. Isabel Fick to lead us from Eskom. Ms. Isabel Fick.
Good morning, everybody. I trust that you can see me. And I can just quickly put up the slides. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see the slides. It's starting with load shedding, national blackout, awareness, system restoration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just trying to get into, there we go. As we've just heard, my name is Isabel Fick. I am the General Manager for Eskom System Operator. This morning, it is my hope that we'll allay some of the fears out there that we may have an imminent system blackout. That is totally not the case. However, as any prudent system operator and any utility in the world, it is our task to prepare for any eventuality from a risk management perspective. And that is what we have done with the blackout. We have been doing preparations for a very long time, as long as we exist, in fact. And I'd like to share some of that with you this morning, and hopefully that will bring some clarity. So to start, I'm just going to give you a quick overview around system operator and load shedding. And you may ask, why am I doing that? And it's because there's a lot of confusion between the concept of load shedding and that of a blackout. So let's have a quick look. First of all, we need to look at what the terminology is. I'm not going to be giving you a seminar on terminology, but load shedding is a controlled, rational interruption of supply, and the purpose thereof is to balance demand and supply. And a national blackout, on the other hand, is a totally unexpected event. It is normally something that happens from a weather event and on the transmission network, not as a result of a lack of capacity on the generation side of a network. So what does system operator do? Well, we are the supervisor of the national network. We look at balancing the network at all times, and this is on a second-to-second basis. We control the transmission network. We look at the maintenance on the network. We look at the stability of the network. We look at all the outages on the network, and that basically is what we do. And of course, voltage stability, frequency stability, and everything that goes around that. Quick overview. This is the fleet that we are looking at. I'm not going to go through all of them, but in total, Eskom has 29 power stations. Then we also have a total of 93 renewable energy IPP stations connected, of which 2 is dispatchable. We look at a vast network, more than 33,000 kilometers of lines in the transmission network. Here is just some of the aspects of what we do on a day-to-day basis. I'm not going to repeat what I've been saying. So we look at security of the supply, continuity of supply, and of course, the quality. Over and above all of this, and our first priority is always the safety of plant and personnel working on the plant, and of course, the general public. So if you look at our neighboring countries, I have just highlighted 2 areas. The one is South Africa, and the other one is Zimbabwe, being the largest neighbor that we have. In terms of electricity network, we are often asked, when we load shed, do we also shed the neighboring countries, or why don't we cut them off? Well, we do reduce the supply that we do give them at any particular time according to the load shedding percentages. But as you can see here, in comparison, we are a much larger grid. And that means that we can assist in the case of a blackout in a neighboring country, but not the other way around. And that's very important to understand when you look at how we look at the restoration process. So why do we load shed? What is the big deal, right? So if you look at the graph in front of you, what we have there in blue is a typical winter profile, and we are now currently in winter. And in red is a typical summer profile. Now in the winter profile, if you look at, that's the load profile, sorry, you will see that we have 2 distinct peaks, one in the morning and one in the late afternoon, evening. And we load shed typically when we cannot match demand and supply. So the orange lines, the top one would be your current supply limit in the winter period, and the bottom line would be a typical one in the summer period. What you will also note on the slide, and very important, is that there is much more shaded red area than there is blue area. This is that during the summertime, our peak is more of a level than 2 distinct peaks, and therefore you can expect load shedding for longer periods of time. The question came up as to why are we only shedding at night, and this is the answer to the question is because we only need to over the evening peak most of the days in winter. So essentially, why do we load shed? We load shed to manage capacity and demand, as I've explained with the peaks. And then also the other reason is that we need to replenish our emergency supplies. At all times, we keep an emergency reserve of 2,200 megawatts on the network. This is to cater for any quick events that happen so that we can keep the network stable. Typically, we're looking at our pump storage stations and our gas, the OCGT stations, which is pictured here in the presentation. So load shedding is not the only tool that we have in terms of managing the national network. And I think it's very important to understand that in terms of balancing, we have a number of levers that we make use of constantly. The reason I'm mentioning this as well is there's been major reports in the media that say that we are exceeding the load shedding stage that we actually tell the public that we're in. This is not true. The reason why we sometimes shed higher than the actual 6,000 or 5,000 or whatever the case might be is because it is not only the load shedding tool being used. We also use a number of others, as you can see on the slide. Not going to go through all of them, but we have a number of programs where we actually contract with large customers to reduce their supply. And then we call that curtailment or demand response, depending on what program we're talking of. And those actually act as levers before we even get to load shedding. And then we also have unscheduled demand reduction. This is when we have a incident on the network and we have to react within milliseconds. It's our under frequency protection scheme. I'm going to show that to you here. And as you can see, there's a number of stages of the under frequency scheme. If you can concentrate on the red block, we have never gone beyond the first stage. So just to give you some comfort here, we have more protection installed. This is hardwired into the network and it is well functioning and properly tested on a regular basis. Now let's get to a national blackout. This is not something that never happens. The probability of a national blackout is extremely low. We have never had a national blackout in South Africa. We have had two regional ones before, and those were both due to, well, one was a event where we had a transfer limit issue to the Western Cape, and the other one was a snow event at KwaZulu-Natal. In those cases, we then had to deal with a regional blackout, and in the case of the Western Cape, we started load shedding, in fact, in 2006, which was the basis of the current load shedding regime that we are using in South Africa. This slide just shows you a number of other areas across the world, and they did have national blackouts. What I'd like you to concentrate on is the causes, and nowhere will you see that it was in fact a lack of capacity that caused a national blackout. In all the cases, it was a cascading event starting in the transmission space. So this is the model that we use when we look at a national blackout. We call it our Swiss cheese model, or you can also look at a domino if you like. Effectively, each of these little blocks represents a barrier that we have in place before we can even get to a national blackout. And as you will see, it starts from the building and designing phase of our equipment, how we operate our equipment, and then also some emergency response that we have. All of those have to align or essentially fail before we can get to a national blackout. Thereafter, we have to restore should it ever happen. And even in that case, we have a number of plans in place, very flexible, I might add, because it will depend on exactly what state the network is in when such an event occurs, in terms of how we will actually bring back the network. If we do have units on islanding, that will be the fastest route. And everyone's asking about the timing. Our estimate is between 6 and 14 days should we ever have to deal with a national blackout. So which are the sectors that can be affected? What can you be expecting? Where should we all be preparing for such an event? Well, these are the different sectors. Of very significant is the telecommunications sector, the water sector, of course, liquid fuels, coal, critical essential loads, security, financial, and retail. Why am I showing you this slide? Not because I want to raise any panic, not because I think it is imminent or that it is ever going to happen, simply because it's prudent for any business to look at its risk management and prepare for any eventuality that may happen. So to conclude, higher stages of load shedding does not imply a grid collapse. We go into the higher stages of load shedding to stabilize the network when we cannot balance demand and supply. It does not mean that we are going to go into a grid collapse. It is not an unexpected event. We are very well in control when that happens. So restoration, as I have mentioned, is between 6 and 14 days. It could even be longer depending on the status of the network at the time of the event. The restoration will primarily be done to facilitate the restoration process. What do I mean with this? The loads that we will pick up in the different stages of restoration will firstly depend on what is available on the network to us to bring back. It would typically be resistive load. It will be stable load, as in domestic load first. We do utilize some of our industrial customers for this. I must also add here that we do intensive testing and exercises in terms of a national blackout. We do them regularly, and we even certify our units for the different abilities needed in the restoration process. I've also discussed with you the number of barriers that is in place. And of course, the first priority will always be the safety of our people and the equipment. And once the grid is stable, we will then look at how we connect the rest of the loads. So we start off with the essential load. And essential load here is meant with what we need to stabilize the network, not essential load by any other definition. It is not about a specific sector or specific institutions. This is literally a load mass to stabilize the generation. Once we have different islands or pockets thereof, we will connect them together to stabilize the total network. And that brings me to the end of my short presentation, and I am ready to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for the insightful presentation. I think you have put the facts very, very clear. And to me, then it's a good platform, even for commentators. When they commentate on the issue of the system, on the issue of the grid, then they have this information, as it's also important to the investors and the world all over. So we are not having any threat of an imminent grid collapse. Thank you very much. We will be taking the questions later. I thought then at this opportunity, at this time, please allow me to invite the CEO of the Energy Council of South Africa, Mr. James McKay, to take us through his presentation. And for all the attendees, there is also a chat group. You might want to deposit your questions so that you don't lose track of them as we proceed. Deposit the questions on the chat, but also write them. Later at the end, we'll be giving you opportunities to also ask the questions. James, we are all yours.
Excellent. Very good morning to the chair, colleagues on the call, and all the attendees listening. I hope that I'm audible. Please let me know if there's a problem, Chair. So I would just quickly, as an introduction, I think a lot of people are not actually sure what the Energy Council does. We really are a sort of, it was established by business, and importantly, both by public and private sector business. So Eskom is a member, a founding member, and a board member of the Energy Council, along with Central Energy Fund, Petro SA, and the IDC. And so we represent a broad constituency of business, but we don't represent businesses' views. We actually, our mandate and focus is the energy transition of South Africa. So in terms of my presentation, I'd like to just quickly step back and give a bit of a broader context around the energy transition. I think first and foremost, I'd like to just also kind of add that as the Energy Council and having, you know, Eskom as a member, we have full confidence in the system operator. I think that there are excellent skills and people, and they're doing incredibly good work. Similarly, on the transmission side, we engage a lot with Eskom, and certainly through the head of transmission, Segomoko Skippers. We have full confidence that I think our transmission system is in a good status in terms of maintenance and in good quality. So we have good confidence in that. I also would like to acknowledge there are a lot of very technically sort of competent people also on the call who are going to present, I think, a very good understanding of what are the technical issues that we're talking about. So on that basis, I'm going to sort of step back a little bit, Chair, just to give a different perspective. I was actually at an event last night with the head of electricity regulation, Nhlanhla Gumede. And one of the things that he said on the stage was that the world is rapidly changing. So we're facing major uncertainty and challenges in the energy. But I think importantly, we are not unique. So I think that there are a few points on the slide that people can look at. But really, we recognize that climate change is very real. I think we've seen just at the moment with summertime in the global north, hottest temperatures ever on record. They say 61,000 people died from heat waves across Europe last year, and a lot more than that in India. So climate change is real, and the energy technology disruption is also very real. And so to give a bit of context of the technology disruption that is coming at us. So the UK, US, EU are all really on track for a net zero power system by 2035. Eskom sort of generation makes up 43% of our emissions. And so we have in our legislation that we must decarbonize. Excuse me. Sometimes people say, well, you know, what is the rest of the world doing? Well, China builds more wind and solar and renewable energy than the UK, US, EU, and India put together every year. And they've done that for the last 3 years. And all major industrial economies are really investing very heavily now in creating sort of local manufacturing skills, capacity, innovation, so that not only can they supply their own energy transition, but also they can play into exports and the global energy platforms. And so we see this like in the US Inflation Reduction Act, $370 billion, the Renew EU, 250 billion euros, China, Japan, all of these countries, Australia, have large programs to incentivize building clean energy industrialization skills and capacity. So I think we've got to start thinking about how South Africa is going to tackle this energy transition. It's not only an energy issue, but it's also what does our future clean tech industrial base look like, and how are we going to be competitive in future global economies and trade. So I think that, you know, what you will see as some of these points is this balancing this energy security and sustainability is a real challenge. And one of the things in that challenge is that most countries in the world are struggling with grid. So expanding grid very rapidly, grid queuing rules, grid optimization, these are not unique challenges. So I think that we've got to recognize that, but really we do have to significantly scale up our focus of investment and the way we look at grid as really our most constrained, but actually one of our most valuable national energy assets. So I think that's an important point, is just around what's the world doing, which leads me to the next point, which is really how are we responding to this as a country? So I think a lot of people must be aware of the engagement and commitment between business and government that was led by the president to create partnerships around action planning and delivery in the areas of energy, transport and logistics, and then crime and corruption. So I think that one thing that we can see is that perhaps our energy crisis has got a silver lining, is that it's really created some structural reform. The sort of government business partnership which has been created, I think is quite unique. It's a real commitment to bring capacity and minds together to really work and to focus. And you can see on the screen here how that's being structured. So as the Energy Council, we're helping to coordinate business resources to be mobilized into those technical areas. And certainly if you look at workstream 10, there's a big focus and a lot of capacity needs to be mobilized into supporting how we're going to expand and rebuild and put a lot of investment into the grid. I think the other areas which are important to mention, though, is that load shedding and the energy crisis really has also stimulated market reform and market liberalization. And certainly from where I am engaging both with industry and business, as well as with NECOM through the presidency and Eskom, we've actually developed a narrative that says we have the technical pathway to solve load shedding and our energy crisis by the end of 2024. So that's the end of next year. And when we go through and we look at where can the megawatts come from, we know that there are plans around the return to service plants, kind of the performance which you see in workstream 1, so improvement of the availability factor and plant performance programs, which is also coming together through business and through government. And there are other areas around external purchases from the Southern African Power Pool. Fantastic work which has also been done by Eskom in starting to liberalize markets and tariff signals. So the standard offer, the emergency generation programs, those are also all stimulating private sector investment, not only in renewables, but also in baseload powers like gas to power. And then we have the renewables program. So both in the private sector programs, but also through the accelerated bid windows. We know bid windows 7 and 8 are on an accelerated program at 5 gigawatts each. So when we look at the amount of gigawatts that are planned and that structurally will come into the system over the next 2 years, I'm confident that we can point on technical programs to sort of 9 to 10 gigawatts, which is more than sufficient to solve load shedding. So really the problem that we are going to face in this is, can we move with speed, and do we have the implementation capacity available to us in order to achieve those programs? And I'm going to finish off really by saying, how do we focus? And I think we must also recognize in this space that there is a lot of economic and social challenges and deficits. This is something which we've battled with after the years of state capture, COVID, and this very challenging and expensive energy transition that we are embarking on. So we do need to kind of rally around a better national energy vision. We need to really scale up investment. I think the things that we often don't give kind of recognition for is that there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes. I think Eskom still is the biggest champion and leader of the reform programs. I think they're still also home to some of our best technical and engineering skills in the electricity space. So there has been good reform. There has been a lot of work done. I think we've got to get this out and really get it into the market so we start to scale up investment, and we get the appetite of investment in the energy space to be recognized as investable, and not the doom and gloom story, which is always that we're going to have blackouts and our energy sector is uninvestable. I don't believe that's really the truth, because there has been a lot of very good technical work that's been done, and I think we really in the market space are on the cusp of seeing big market liberalization. If we look at the ERA, which is waiting to go through Parliament, we see the non-discriminatory access to the grid being legislated, formation of a national transmission company, formation of markets. I think we're nearly ready to publish national wheeling programs through rules through NERSA. Eskom are nearly ready to launch market grid codes in order to also accelerate investment in the energy sector. So there is a lot of positive things that we can take. There is good news. I do believe we really have a realistic technical path to end load shedding and our energy crisis sooner rather than later. But it is going to take a real collaboration of working together, business and government, and Eskom. And at the moment, as I said on the previous slide, I think we're really seeing that this is a unique opportunity in order to do that, which, perhaps without an energy crisis, we may have continued to drift. But it is an opportunity. We need to grab it with both hands and really try and sort of go and grab what we have available to us. So, Chair, I'm going to stop there. I hope that gave a very quick, broad perspective of where we sit in this global energy transition. Certainly, as South Africa, I think that we do have challenges, but we are not unique in those challenges. And we do have the capability and the opportunity to actually deal with those challenges and to come out, I think, with a much better and a thriving and a very vibrant energy sector. But we are running out of time, and I think we've got to kind of rally together and really focus on implementation. So thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to leave it there, and we'll be very happy to take questions later.
Thank you very much, James. I think what you also emphasized was that there is nothing insurmountable if all stakeholders work together, especially if we have a common approach. Colleagues, James also heads the energy work stream for business for South Africa at NECOM. So I think there is that knowledgeable inside and input that he has put. That also brings the element of all working together to deal with the issue. Without any more time, colleagues, let me then invite Mr. Vali Padayachi, the CEO of the National Rationalized Specifications Association of South Africa. Mr. Vali.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, fellow panelists. Good morning to members of the public. Just a slight correction. I'm actually the chairperson of the NRS Association of South Africa. I'm also the strategic advisor to the AMU and a former executive manager of Eskom and a former senior executive of City Power Johannesburg. Firstly, given that we are in the middle of winter and there's always talk in the media and in the public that we could be going into a blackout situation and a collapse of the grid, given the nature of the grid, especially the ESCOM generation assets. So I want to thank the GCIS for giving the NRS an opportunity to give the public out there, from an independent perspective, independent meaning from the NRS Association, a sense of comfort that we are nowhere near to a national blackout and a total grid collapse, even though we're going into what we call a winter peak, maybe third week in July, and for the first week in August. And Chair, just to say that my presentation seeks to support the system operator and the various distribution centers around the country, and we'll talk to that in the next few slides. Okay, I think firstly, people wonder who is the NRS Association of South Africa. We've been in existence for approximately 25 years. We work in the background, and we've actually, it's a powerful organization, powerful unincorporated non-profit organization brought together by like-minded organizations, and it was created in the main to serve the technical interests of the ESI and the EDI, with an end goal of inter alia keeping the national grid resilient, safe, and reliable. And our membership, as I say, is a very powerful membership. It includes all 8 metros in the country. It includes all the municipalities in the country represented by the AMU. We also include the South African Bureau of Standards, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, and ESCOM Holdings, which includes all the line groups of ESCOM, and now and again we co-opt other parties. What is the business of the NRS Association? Very quickly. And at a very high level, Chair, the business of the NRS Association, through its various members, work groups, activities, standards, etc., in the context of the mandate, is to protect the national electricity grid of South Africa, period. We will not hesitate to exercise this mandate at a moment's notice, and especially during a power system emergency, without fear or favor, to prevent the national grid from going into a blackout situation and a total grid collapse. I think this point is very, very critical. We want to give the public out there and the other key stakeholders the assurance that without any fear or favor, we will compromise the integrity of the grid in support of the system operator, national control, and the distribution centers. That, I think the public must get assurance we will not compromise the grid. Of course, we must take cognizance that South Africa and ESCOM has not experienced a total blackout in its 100 years of existence, and we do not intend for this to happen even now in the context of the current national electricity crisis. Lest we forget, we need to recognize those engineers, technicians, operators, etc., that are working in ESCOM system operator, ESCOM national control, the ESCOM distribution centers, ESCOM and the municipal power station control rooms, the various municipal distribution control centers that are doing a fantastic job as a collective in keeping the national grid afloat. We call them the pilots of the national grid. In other words, just as the pilot keeps the aircraft afloat, these fantastic people. I understand there's about 750, close to 800 people that man the national grid that are doing a fantastic job in keeping it afloat. And importantly, point number 5, importantly, the NRS 048 Part 9, which is the standard or the code of practice that we utilize to regulate load shedding, does not subrogate. Subrogate is a legal term which the lawyers use to say that the system operator, national control distribution centers, have full-blanche authority in an emergency to take whatever action is necessary to keep the grid safe. And that means even going to advanced levels of load shedding to do so. And the NRS Association, with its mandate, have consciously exercised that mandate to give that flexibility to the system operator so that we do not compromise them in any way, especially in an emergency, that by taking any action, it may compromise the grid. Okay. Now, if you look at the last point there, point number 6, in essence, the NRS 048 Part 9 strives to balance 3 fundamental objectives. And I think we must just take cognizance of this. The first objective is that we strive to maintain an equitable distribution of the burdens and pain caused by electricity shortage. So whenever there's a shortage in the country of power, we try and equitably distribute that pain countrywide. And we also govern to do so by the Act in terms of equity. Of course, point B, we avoid at all costs the catastrophic consequences of a blackout and a total grid collapse. And of course, we also talk a lot about essential loads and critical loads. This is a busy slide, but I won't go into all the details. Why the need for a code of practice? Of course, like any other country, we have national assets, we have critical assets, and every country, its paramount goal is to protect its national assets. Arguably, the electricity grid of any country is a national asset. It's actually, in most countries, the largest machinery that's been developed in any country, and so in South Africa. I think in South Africa, I could argue as well that the national grid is the biggest machinery that's been developed in the country. And of course, we try and protect it, and even in South Africa, we follow the same processes. And one of the critical elements where we protect is obviously to prevent the grid from going into a national blackout and into a total collapse. And in other words, in essence, the NRS 048 Part 9 standard is that we seek to prepare the nation, the 65 odd million people in different contexts, as best as we can to avoid the grid going into a blackout and into a total collapse. This is a busy slide, but there are four main areas where we exercise our propensity to avoid us going into a blackout situation. The first one, say point A, is when the grid is operating very tightly. So, and generally it operates tightly. I would argue in the current situation, when we try to maximize maintenance, maintain environmental compliance. So there we do load reduction. I would just also emphasize that load reduction and load shedding are synonymous terms. They are the same. So whether you use load reduction, which is a technical term, or load shedding, which the public understands, they're the same term. And then when you have a compromised operating regime, when the system operator finds it difficult to balance the demand and supply, then there would be regular intermittent reduction for days or weeks. And then when there's an extended constrained operating regime, lack of generation, energy resource constraints, etc., then we would load shed for even longer periods, and of course when there's a major incident. And I don't want to go into detail on this slide, just to emphasize what the system operators said in their presentation. Load shedding is not the only means to avoid a blackout. And also, we must emphasize that the final system defense against a blackout is what we call an under-frequency protection scheme. And even there, we have 7 different levels to protect the grid. And just very quickly, the importance of NRS 048 Part 9 comes in at this level. So the system operator and national control will exhaust all of these interventions, the blue part, the light brownish part, and then the code of practice NRS 048 part kicks in an emergency at this level. And you'll see here that edition 3, the latest edition, goes up to stage 16. I must caution the public not to believe this is an unlikely event that will go to stage 16. But why we got to stage 16 is that we've taken the entire load, the demand, the entire load of the country, which is about 32 gigs, and we equated that to stage 16. But we want to show the public that this is an unlikely event. We could go beyond stage 6, could go beyond stage 7 or 8, maybe 9 or 10, but we don't believe that the NRS will get to stage 14, 15, or 16. And then in terms of timing, for 15 minutes and 2 hours, the system operator would look at load curtailment, other emergency requirements. But then when you get on to 30 minutes, then the NRS 048 Part 9 standard kicks in. And all the requirements that go with that standard or code of practice kicks in. And then when you get into a millisecond operation, then you get into an under frequency operation. What this slide seeks to say is to give the assurance to the public that we have a code of practice, NRS 048, carefully thought out, carefully engineered, consulted, that gives the public further assurance that the system operator, national control, has adequate support, technical support, to prevent the grid from going into a blackout. And just some further refinements in terms of the code, the aspects of equity. In other words, we can't favor one batch of customers to another. The Act, in terms of the ERA, is very clear on that. And it's also a license condition, so all utilities, electricity utilities, editions 1 and 2 is part of the license condition. We're hoping that edition 3, which has been signed off by the NRS, we've signed it off as a document. It's now being considered by NESA to make that a legal and compliance document on that. And also, I think point number F, the code also caters for applications for exemptions. But I must add here that given the business of the NRS, any application for exemption will be predicated by the fact that to see if the grid gets compromised in terms of a blackout or a collapse. If it's so, then the exemptions will not be given that priority. And just to emphasize what I mentioned early on, that edition 3 now caters for up to stage 16. That's in the unlikely event of going into stage 16. As I mentioned to you, edition 1 we went up to stage 4 because we thought we'll never get beyond stage 2 load shedding. Then we went to edition 2, which we went up to 8 stages of load shedding because we thought we'll never get beyond stage 4. And now we're sitting at stage 6. So the NRS, as a prudent, credible organization, thought, let's, in the unlikely event of going to stage 16, support and prepare national control system operator, the distribution centers, community control centers against that, and hence we formalized capability up to stage 16. Because bear in mind, colleagues, the national grid is one of the most complex, complicated, high-tech machinery that you can get, and it needs the complete synergy, synchronicity of those 800 people to by the second, because the grid is monitored by the second in terms of supply and demand. The supply and demand is not met by the second in terms of frequency, we will collapse the grid. So in terms of that stage 16, we feel that where the national grid is at the moment, especially the generation assets, we've adequately prepared, and we take comfort in that we will not get into a blackout situation, into a total grid collapse, even in the midst of this winter. And we firmly believe that the 3rd week of July, the 1st week in August would be that critical period, but we take comfort that we will not get into a blackout and a total grid collapse. But we cannot give you the assurance that we won't go beyond stage 6 or advanced levels of load shedding. But I must re-emphasize, load shedding is the most effective, or one of the effective tools in preventing a blackout. But we have other tools. In fact, national control system operator as an armor of interventions in the kitty, besides load shedding, to prevent the grid from getting into a blackout. So that comfort we want to give to the public. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope I was able to give you that comfort in terms of the resiliency, reliability of the South African grid. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Valley. Thank you also for adding the voice from the platform of the voluntary forums of like-minded organizations, which include, of course, the organizations that you have mentioned. We will also keep track of the questions that are placed on the chat for your attention when we come to the questions. On that note, let me invite then Professor Jan de Kock, the president of South African Institute of Electrical Engineering. Prof, we are all yours.
Good morning, everybody. Can you see my screen?
I think they are working on it. It's still coming, that side. Yeah, thanks, Prof. It's here.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. What I'd like to talk about this morning is, first of all, just give you an overview of who the Institute is and where I come from. Then I'd like to talk about an international perspective to blackouts, then turn the focus to South Africa, and talk about triggers and causes, and talk about unique aspects to the South African grid, and then talk about risks and conclude with a few remarks. So the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers was founded in 1909. We represent about 4,500 electrical engineering practitioners across all disciplines of electrical engineering. I am the president of the Institute for this year. I also lecture in Northwest University, where I also do research into power system performance, and I have 35 years experience in power system performance. So let's start. If we look at blackouts over the world, you'll see that it's not an uncommon phenomena. Every year, millions of people are affected worldwide by blackouts. And here you can see how historically blackouts have affected people across the world. Let's take a look at what has happened in New York, or the northeast part of the USA. First major blackout there occurred in 1965, which affected 30 million people for 13 hours. Then in 1977, there was a blackout in New York affecting 9 million people for 16 hours. And this also led to looting and arson and criminal activity at the time. This is the only event in the US where this happened. And then in 2003, there was a blackout again, 55 million people for 7 hours. And then in 2019, Manhattan had a blackout that affected 73,000 people for 5 hours. What I'd like to show you from this is that over a period of nearly 60 years, the Eastern United States has had 4 major incidents. And despite having learned a lot of lessons from each of them, they still occur. This is what happened in 2003. You can see the blackout around New York at night, black area in the circle. If we have a little look at the details, the system frequency changed from 60 hertz down to by 1.5 hertz and went up by 3 1/3 hertz. Over this period, 63 gigawatts was lost. They shed 10.5 gigawatt. As I said earlier, they affected 55 million people. 400 transmission lines were lost. 152 reactors, transformers, and capacitor banks were lost, and 531 units of 261 power stations tripped during this event. If we look at South Africa, in the beginning of the 1970s, the grids in South Africa were connected together. Prior to that, the whole provinces were literally grids on their own. And with the connection of the Natal undertaking at the time, there was a blackout in KwaZulu-Natal. Then by 1973, the grid was completely interconnected. And in 1975, we then had 3 major events. And I'd just like to look at the worst one, which happened on the 4th of December, 1975. It was a result of a CT failure at Balkan substation near Witbank. 24 units at 4 power stations tripped, and the frequency varied from somewhere around 47.5 hertz up to 52.5 hertz. And 45% of the national load was lost in this period, and it was restored back 6 hours later. Second worst event was on the 4th of April, 1988, where 24% of the national load was lost. This was a result of 2 units at Kuburg tripping and 2 at Lutabu, and that happened over a period of 30 minutes. So if we look at all multiple unit trips, something that Isabel Fick had spoken about, every dot on this graph represents an incident going back from 1975 up to the present. And you'll see that over this period, the number of units that have tripped have not increased significantly, bearing in mind that a typical power station unit is around 600 megawatts. You'll see that the highest ones we've had is around 3,800 megawatts. If you look at this slightly differently, each of the diamond dots represents an incident in South Africa where only South African units were involved. And here I'm just looking at the major ones. And if you look at the stars, you'll see that in this case, we also had trips across borders. So in other words, for example, Zimbabwe may have affected us, or we may have affected Zimbabwe with these incidents. So what causes a blackout? First of all, you need an inherent weakness in a system. Then you need to set up a scene. In other words, things need to come together as a system with some weaknesses, and then there's a trigger that then starts the ball rolling. And a blackout is then a series or a sequence of discrete steps. It's not just a single event. It can take multiple minutes. If you look at the one in New York that developed over a matter of nearly 2 hours. So as long as the events are interrelated, it is termed multiple unit trip. And in the process, you find that generation and network assets become compromised, and eventually there's a disconnection of loads and generators, and you have a blackout. So following on what Isabel Fickett said, how resilient is a network, and our network as an example, there are often threats to the network. And for that, we have in place resilient barriers. And most of these, virtually all of them, all these threats are blocked by this resilience barrier. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Then, should an event go through all the holes in the Swiss cheese using Isabel's model, you could have a cascade of events, and even there is a barrier that very few of these events would actually lead to a blackout. If that were to happen, then you'd look at black starting or self-starting parts of the power system through generators. Boilers are typically islanded. And if they are successfully islanded, one can use them again in the restoration attempt. So in restoring the grid, it might not happen. Then you could restore the grid all at once or with the first attempt. So again, there's a barrier, and depending on how successful you are, you can then restore the system. How quickly that'll happen is very difficult to say. It depends very much on the nature of what is tripped and how quickly one can get those units back online. Looking at some of the typical causes or triggers that can lead to a blackout, often nature is involved. It can also be network disturbances, for example, faults. Thinking back to one of the 4th of December 1975, that started off with a fault. Then you could have plant breakdowns, human error. There can be design issues or other issues that can also act as triggers to a blackout. If we look at what are we good at, in many cases in the world where we have blackouts, there have been multiple system operators. In South Africa, we are fortunate to only have one system operator. And if we look at history, you'll see that in places where there's a single system operator, the chances of having a blackout are far less than having multiple system operators. Then South African grid code is unique in the world in that we have a detailed section on multiple unit trips. This is something that is only now being written into other grid codes and only so far in Europe. Then we've had extensive experience with load shedding and operating with small reserve margins. And in South Africa, we've been investigating multiple unit trips for the last 50 years. And then lastly, most of our units at power stations have islanding capabilities to operate on their own for a period of time. And then many of our thermal plants can actually be turned down to an output of 50%. On the negative side, we're often operating close to the edge, and very few of our plants have black start capabilities. And then there's always the risk of common plant at power stations, things that are common to the entire station that could cause a multiple unit trip. Furthermore, we've had very little experience at restarting the system. There are exercises from time to time, but exercises are pre-set up and are quite different from the real thing. And then one must look at how available key black start power stations are. And at this stage, we have a problem primarily with the Tutuka power station, which is one of the key stations when trying to black start South African grid. So let's look at some of the emerging risks. I'm not going to list all of them, but as we add more renewable energy generation to our grid, system inertia is dropping, which means that if we have multiple unit trips, the rate of change of frequency is going up. And that means we need to react a lot faster than we have in the past. And then cybersecurity is also an issue that we need to start looking at. And here you can see some of the other issues that we need to also consider. We often don't talk about the consequences of having a blackout. This will typically result in food shortages, water shortages, like we've seen now in Johannesburg, where the Rand Water was reconfiguring its system, probably lead to fuel shortages, health risks, limited digital communication, and ultimately civil unrest. So these are the things we'd like to avoid. And then in conclusion, I'd like to say, never say never. After the 2003 blackout in New York, journalists asked the Italian and Swedish system operators whether something like this could happen in their countries, and both emphatically said that is not possible. And within a matter of 6 weeks, both countries had blackouts. So what do? We develop defensive strategies by doing benchmarking, developing contingency plans, as Isabel Fick spoke about. There's a lot of simulated testing, and we learn from incidents. And by doing that, we improve the robustness of our designs, and that reduces the risk of having a blackout. A lot of this work has been done from research by Michiel van Leeuwen and myself. Data has come from historical data, the transactions of the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers, and then various reports on the blackouts in the USA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think, Prof, after your presentation, I strongly feel we could have done this webinar long time before, because it assists in terms of giving us, the scientific facts, and they would have helped, because what we have been having was panic of Greek collapse. Thank you very much, Prof. Let me, without more wasting time, take on Dr. Sipho Mdluli, who is the principal researcher at the CSIR. Doctor, we are all yours.
Thank you, Chair. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it clearly, Doctor.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that introduction, Chair. My name is Sipho Mdluli. I'm a principal researcher at CSIR's Energy Center. I'm part of the team that's responsible for conducting generation least cost optimization studies. These are RP type of studies, as well as a generation adequacy assessment. With me is Monique Leroux, who will be sharing this presentation with me, and is also from the Energy Center, and is part of the team that's predominantly responsible for conducting grid studies. Right. Electricity in South Africa is generated at a frequency of 50 hertz. But the generation capacity is perfectly in balance with the load. If the frequency is at 50 hertz, and if our generation is more than the load, the frequency moves to the right. And if generation is insufficient to meet the load, the frequency is less than 50 hertz. A grid collapse is a scenario where Eskom is not generating any electricity at all. And we don't want this to be confused with the current load shedding that South Africa is experiencing. There are a number of ways in which a grid collapse can actually take place, and especially when there's an imbalance between generation supply resources as well as the demand that leads to a complete disconnection of all resources. An imbalance can occur in one of two ways, either due to insufficient generation capacity due to equipment failures, or demand spikes that exceeds available generation resources. Right, so how did we get here? The graph on the left shows an EAF trajectory actuals, as well as the number of EAF scenarios that were considered in the publications of the MTSAO, Eskom's MTSAO 2022 report, which is what I'm referencing here, as well as the EAF scenario that formed the basis of producing the Integrated Resource Plan 2029. So the graph on the left clearly shows that EAF reduced from the high of about 85% in the financial year 2010 and dropped to about 61.8% by financial year 2022. The graph in red basically shows the low EAF scenario that was considered in the publications of the MTSAO. And this is statistically derived EAF based on how the EAF has been trending historically. And again, that scenario shows an EAF that improves, that reduces to about 55.5% in financial year 2025 and improves marginally to 60.6% by financial year 2031. And again, if you compare the EAF, even in that low EAF, the EAF for financial year 2023 in that low EAF scenarios of 59.9, and you compare it with the actuals that that Eskom has been able to achieve for the same financial year, the EAF for financial year 2023 is sitting at 54%. So which basically shows that even in that low EAF scenario, it is particularly difficult to plan for a system using these deterministic parameters. When you compare this with the EAF that was used in the IRP, you can see that again, the IRP assumed a significantly high EAF, and this is, it's not where we are at the moment. Right, in terms of additional generation resources that have been added based on Section 34 ministerial determinations, again, we are referencing the RP 2010 here. And so far, we've been able to connect 2,287 megawatts of solar PV to the network by 2022. And we've also connected 3,343 megawatts of wind to the network by 2022. Up to 500 megawatts of CSP has been connected as well. Right. Since what we're saying with this slide is that since the publications of the Integrated Resource Plan 2010, which formed the basis of Section 34 ministerial determination, the amount of capacity that we've been able to connect thus far translate to an annual average build rate for solar of approximately 175 megawatts per year. And that annual average for wind translates to about 257 megawatts per year, right? So the key message we're saying here is that if you look at the magnitude by which the EAF deteriorated, clearly the pace at which we've been adding capacity fails to keep pace with the level of the degradations that we're currently experiencing. Again, in terms of Eskom's new build, Medupi-Kusile, if we reference the RP 2010, according to the RP 2010, the last unit of Medupi was expected to be completed by 2017. The last unit of Kusile was also expected to be completed by 2020. You contrast that with where we are now, again referencing the MTSAO 2022 reports, which clearly states that the last unit of Medupi, which broke down, is expected to be reconnected by August 2024, and the last unit of Kusile is expected sometime in 2024. So again, the message is pretty much the same here. There are significant challenges in adding capacity to keep up with the level of erosions that we're currently seeing on the energy availability factor. Why is there no grid collapse at this stage? Load shedding is implemented to ensure that frequency remains within the frequency dead bands. The South African grid is a highly integrated grid and has a lot of automated processes in place over and above the manual load shedding. For example, the system has under frequency load shedding system, which will automatically shed load to prevent grid collapse. It is our view at this particular point that a total grid collapse is highly improbable. It's not highly probable, but we cannot certainly exclude it as an option that is completely impossible for it to materialize. Again, if you look at the current level of penetrations of VRE in the system, we also do not suspect that these 6 gigawatts that's been connected to the grid pose a significant risk from an inertia point of view, right? Going forward, well, that might be a challenge. In terms of some of the countries that have experienced blackout, power outages that we are showing here are based on the 3 criteria that we are listing here. Bullet number 1, an outage must be an unplanned outage. The number of people affected must be more than 1,000. The duration of an outage must be more than 1 hour. Texas electric grid is experiencing an outage in 2021. The grid lost a total of about 50,000 megawatts of generation capacity and affected around 4.5 million homes and lasted for about 3 days. The failure of this generating unit is due to multiple cases, the chief of which was the winter's storm Uri experienced that year that rendered the generation units improbable. South America also experienced a massive blackout in 2019, a massive power failure that occurred on Sunday, the 16th of June, 2019, around 7 o'clock in the morning, that left Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and some cities in Chile without power. The outage affected 44 million of South Americans. Power was restored to 90% of Argentina, 3 million residents of Uruguay, and several people in Paraguay later that evening through efforts of local authority. Again, Pakistan experienced power outages in 2023, a nationwide power outage occurred in Pakistan on Monday, the 23rd of January, 2023 at about 7:34 a.m. And that outage left around 220 million without electricity. Australia likewise experienced an outage in 2022. That widespread blackout affected Melbourne airports and around 17,000 households. So it's we're saying a total blackout is not highly possible, but you can never say never. We concur with what Jan is basically saying. Okay, in terms of the shutdowns, right? The graph again shows the 2 EAF that we considered in the publications of the MTSO 2022, that red line, which is historically, which is statistically derived based on the historical performance and the high EAF scenario considered in that publication. The bottom bars shows the amount of capacity that we are going to shut down, according to the MTSO publication, because the stations are going to reach the 50-year end of life. According to the publication, Eskom fleet is expected to reduce by about 5.2 gigawatts between 2023 and 2027. And according to the RP 2010, close to about 10 gigawatts of generation capacity is expected to be decommissioned or shut down, rather. All right, so we're saying in this scenario, clearly, even if we improve the EAF here from the low EAF assumed in the MTSO to a high EAF, this would be at the expense of a reduced installed base. So we are of the view that Eskom needs to consider their position in terms of the shutdowns, especially if there's going to, if there's not going to be enough generation resources to basically, take over, cover the slack in order to minimize the level of load shedding. We are not essentially advocating for non-compliance because these stations also need to comply with minimum emission standards. So we're not advocating for life extensions at all costs, but rather we're saying, if we're going to be shutting down stations, we need to make sure, be it 5.2 or 10 gigawatts, according to the RP, we need to make sure that there's additional generation capacity that is ready to produce power and that is also able to completely eliminate load shedding altogether. We are unwavering in saying that it does not make sense to shut down these stations either due to end of life or non-compliance if there's no additional generation capacity. So, right, next slide. In terms of a pipeline capacity that is expected to mitigate the supply shortfall, the re-IPP bid window 7 is yet to be, an RFP is yet to be published, and that bid window is going to add more than 2,600 megawatts. I think one of the panelists mentioned the numbers here. The risk mitigations, the risk mitigation options in the RP 2019 is expected also to add 2,000 megawatts. Whether this is going to materialize, we're not sure about that. So we know that there's quite a significant hurdles and basically advancing the car power ships that are part of the 2,000 megawatts that are supposed to be connected. Right. The previous slide basically shows the conventional power generators that are expected to be shut down according to the MTSO 2022, and this picture here basically shows that the amount of generation capacity that is expected to come online. Some of it is at an advanced level and some of it is still in its planning phase. But the key thing to notice in this slide is that the generation capacity that we're adding is dominated by solar PV and wind. So essentially, we're going to be replacing our generation capacity, conventional generation capacity, which are able to contribute to in Asia with inverter-based generation capacity that could cause a problem for system operator. So we ask that there be a coordinated effort in adding this capacity online. Our system operator together with grid planners need to be involved in order to determine whether the moment of inertia for the system operator is within acceptable threshold. And if it is below that, if there's sufficient mechanism to actually arrest frequency deviations due to a now much lower nadir that results from integrating a significant amount of renewable into the system. All right, so we're not opposed to this. We're saying let this happen, but I think the important thing here is that we need to make sure that we're adding this capacity, and there's not going to be any operational issues associated with adding this. That may be a strong coordinated effort to do this. I'm now going to pass over this presentation to Monique. Thank you, Chair.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Sipho. I'm sort of going to take over from where Sipho left off. As he said at the beginning of the presentation, I'm Monique Leroux, and I also work together with Sipho at CSIR at the Energy Centre. We're in a research group called Energy Systems, where we work quite closely together with Eskom and government to look at sort of the energy roadmap for the country, as well as grid considerations. And I'm just going to touch on some of the work that we've been doing with Eskom, looking at sort of the science behind the grid and how that's operated, to hopefully give some comfort that there is work going on in the background where all these issues and factors are taken into account and properly planned for. If I can just start from where Sipho left over, I think this slide, we could just quickly go through it. Private generation projects below 100 megawatts. Those need to be below 100 megawatts and above 100 kilowatt. Those needs to be registered with NERSA. And it's just to conclude on the previous slide, where it shows that there is probably going to be a lot of new renewables connected to the grid. These are the projects, private projects that's come online since 2022, and everyone can see that there's sort of been quite a steep increase in new renewable projects on the private front. So our expectation very much is that as coal and our traditional baseload power stations get scaled down due to end of lifetime, due to climate considerations, due to cost considerations, that there's going to be a massive uptake in renewable energy generation on the grid. And as Sipho and Jan also mentioned, that these new renewable energy generators bring some interesting factors onto the grid that needs to be taken account of, and that's what we've been sort of the research that we've been doing the last couple of months, which I'll just quickly take you through just for interest's sake and just to sort of set the scene with what we're busy with. Next slide, thanks, Sipho. Okay, risk to the system, so just what I mentioned. A lot of the coal-fired stations are reaching the end of lifetime, and they are going to be decommissioned in the next couple of years, according to Eskom's decommissioning schedule. So there's the risk that there's a shutdown of around 16 gigawatts of base load power that's going to sort of defect off the grid, and then those will probably be filled with renewable energy sources due to the fact that these sources can be connected quite quickly. There's also cost consideration that makes it easy for companies and for private investors to invest in renewable energy, because the cost is a bit lower than building a massive base load power station. So those are things that on the grid that we've been looking at. See if we can go to the next slide, thanks. Okay, just maybe some terminology which will hopefully give a bit of background and make what I'm saying in the next few slides a bit more sense. As Sipho have mentioned, and some of the other panelists also have mentioned, our system frequency 50 hertz throughout the whole country. That's our frequency, and it's regulated quite closely to that. There's a frequency deadband of 49.8 and 50.1 around that, where the system frequency will deviate because there are changes on the system. And we won't stress about those deviations. Those are normal system frequencies in the dead band. And then when there are larger events on the system, like large customers that disconnect from the system, or big faults on the network, or if a large generator disconnects, then your frequency would either fall or rise above that level. But as Isabel also illustrated and presented quite well, that is very well managed by the system operator and also by the system automatically. And that brings us to system inertia and what that is. And then system inertia is the system's resistance to change in, you can stay on that slide, thanks, Sipho. So you can go back to the previous slide. It's the system's resistance to change in the velocities. We know that the big, for instance, the coal-fired power stations or the big hydro stations, they've got big rotating mass, big machines that spin around, and there's an inherent energy that's caught up in those rotating machines that will cause the system to be resistant to change. So if there's a small change on the system can easily ride through that, and that keeps our system very stable. And traditionally, South Africa has had a very stable system due to this, because we've had large generators that's all connected to the grid and keeps our system stable. But in future, that might change a little bit as some of that traditional baseload power gets replaced by renewable energy generators, which are small machines that don't keep the grid as stable and bring other considerations into play. You can go to the next slide. So inertial energy, as I said, it's defined as a body's resistance to change of motion. So the generators are spinning, they've got massive energy stored in them. So if there's a small change on the system, it's not going to impact the system frequency. These synchronous machines, the baseload power, coal, hydro, they assist in keeping the electric power system's frequency stable. And as these are displaced by renewable energy generators, there will be a higher erosion of system inertial energy. And Jan also touched on this, the rates of change of frequency will increase. So if you see a disturbance on the network, your frequency will deviate quickly, either going down or going up, and that does put the system at risk. But yeah, the work that we do looks at this and looks at the impact of this going forward, so that if there are changes that need to be made, these can be done and can be mitigated for properly. Next slide. Okay, so this is a system that we use together with Eskom. Eskom should receive a lot of credit for the system. It's a power system modeling tool that they've been using in Eskom for many number of years, in which they keep very good track of and maintain very well. So this system and this modeling software has got every element on the network modeled into. So every power station, every generator, every substation, every load is modeled onto the system. Every line, every transformer is modeled in there. So if you just look at the diagram to the left, that's the country map, and all those S's are substations in South Africa. All the high voltage substations are modeled into this model, so that you've got a complete model of the energy system and you know exactly what's going to happen. So with this, if there's any change on the system, you can model it on the software and you'll see exactly how your system is going to respond to that. So I think that should give people a bit of comfort that it isn't that the system operator or Eskom planning in general is wondering what's going to happen when they add a new generator, when they take away a line, when a system event happens, because this can be modeled on the system beforehand, and you can see exactly to sub-second level how the system is going to respond to whichever scenario, whichever change is brought onto the system. And just maybe to the right, the control systems there, that's just an example of a generator that's on the Eskom network. The whole control system of the generator, every mechanism, every control system is represented there in full mathematical models. So whichever change you're going to bring about, every setting that's changed on the generator, every setting that's changed on the network can be modeled completely and accurately, which obviously is a very powerful tool for planners and operators to use, because that sort of gives you eyes into how you can operate your system and what's going to happen, so that you don't have to is live, to just sort of want insight into what's happening on the system without the need of that being implemented in practice. Next slide. Again, this is just a study that we recently undertook with Eskom to determine mitigation against the impact of reduction of synchronous generators and the reduction of inertial energy in South Africa as renewable energy generators are scaled up on the grid. So this is a result of the software that we used there. We looked at the various years, 2022 to 2030, and then as renewable energy increases throughout those years, according to the IRP 2019 roadmap, we can see exactly how that impacts your system stability and your system frequency. So the graph just shows the system frequency. Normal operation started the frequency deadband, and then we did a big trip on the system, one of the larger generator unit trips, and then you can see exactly what's going to happen to your frequency, how your system is going to respond. For this case, we just depended on the generator governor systems, which basically is the generator control system built into the generator, which will try and arrest the frequency deviations and frequency changes. And as you can see, we can see exactly how that changes with increased renewable energy, or for basically for any other event on the system, what the expectation is, either your system is going to respond to that. See if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so obviously, as you can see on the previous slide, as renewable energy increases, there's an inherent risk that the system might become a little bit more unstable, but you can mitigate against those. And that's also as part of the study that we looked at the mitigation against inertial erosion and declining system stability, what can be done for that. So then we look at future network scenarios, what needs to be brought online to keep the system stable so that you can keep the system frequency within the stable range. And then some of the mitigation measures is instantaneous reserves. That's the reserves in the generators that can be used to keep the system stable. And then demand response measures, which basically equates to load shedding or to the under frequency load shedding scheme that will operate to keep your system stable and your frequency within that band. And then that is the graph on the left, was where we tripped some of the load blocks on the system, and then you can see exactly how your system frequency is going to respond. The blue line just shows a bit of an overshoot in the frequency, so then you know exactly how much load you need to trip or how much you need to keep online so that you can keep your frequency stable. And then on the right hand side, we introduced some battery energy storage onto the system, which battery energy storage provides really well, very good fast frequency response, and can respond to any frequency changes quite well. So as you can see, you sort of want a stable system, and there are quite a few things that we can do going forward. For instance, battery energy storage. There are other measures like synchronous condensers, etc., that you can also introduce into your system to keep it stable and keep it in an operating space where it's easy to operate your system. Okay, I think that was my last slide. One slide, thanks. This was also just a critical inertia, determining what's the minimum level of system inertia that's needed to ensure the frequency response through your resources can be deployed effectively before the frequency drops below the grid code limit. So basically, let me just look at certain network conditions. You look at how many synchronous generators you've got connected on your connected, how much mitigation you've got, for instance, synchronous condensers or battery or whatever, and then you determine, as you scale those up and down, what is your critical inertia response. So these are studies that are ongoing in the background. this Eskom sort of obviously the leader in this, and we're supporting them where we've got research projects together. And yeah, I think the aim with this is just to give people comfort that there is studies that are ongoing that looks at the system on an ongoing basis to determine if that safety margins are in place, if the system can be run stably, and if mitigation is necessary. And as Isabel also said, just to reference the Swiss cheese model again, it starts at the very beginning when the system is designed and implemented. That's where you already start looking at grid stability and how it can be done long-term and safely throughout the whole process. And this is one tool that we use for that, and it's a very powerful tool. And yeah, it's used internationally, and Eskom has really put a lot of work into using this software and getting all the systems in place to model it accurately. And yeah, I think that's all that I want to add before I start repeating myself and waffling too much, but that's the end of our presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Monique, and thank you very much, Dr. Nduli. My dear panelists and the attendees, I see the time, it's a little bit not on our side. I'm going to quickly dedicate this 10 minutes, the last 10 minutes on reading. I think we've got close to 20 or 17 questions. Some I think are comments. So I will read all the questions, and then the panelists can then pick some of those questions. And then at the end, I will then take the hands from the platform. I can see that some of the questions are directed mostly to Isabel Fick. Let me start with an anonymous attendee. It says, with the 2024 elections approaching, is Eskom able to resist possible requests from politicians not to load shed to the extent it needs to in order to maintain grid stability? The second question is from Terence Creamer to Isabel Fick. What system services does Kuberg provide to the grid? What will happen to those services should both units be unavailable simultaneously? Another anonymous attendee, please can the presenters please comment on the risks associated with Kuberg and its 2 units being down at the same time? Then we have Ramne Ryan via what is being done to prepare for recovery of the grid in the unfortunate event of a blackout, considering that recovery will also be dependent on availability of communication networks. From Carol Payton, good morning, panelists. Carol Payton from News 24. Could Ms. Fick please give us a bit of a technical briefing on the potential scenario of the Western Cape being without Kuberg 1 and 2 simultaneously, and what this will mean for regional grid stability? Paul Vermeulen, City Power, Johannesburg. How is the UFLS system tested? We have struggled with frequency determined load balancing in the past at Kelvin Power Station. It was a dynamic system and was difficult to match scheduled load to available generation. When it did operate, it will overshoot and trip Kelvin out on overspeed. Anonymous attendee, Europe still imports our coal for energy. How can South Africa be taking big loans from JET from countries that they themselves still use fossil fuels? Anonymous attendee, why is South Africa not looking at investments towards nuclear power as if it is much more worthwhile long-term? Gerard Human, I think what he has written is more of a comment, but not a question. Paul Vermeulen of City Power, Eskom should not be the biggest champion of reform. That is the role of the DMRE, missing in action or driven by a different agenda. Gerard, again, is he's just also giving a comment, and anonym, and then Siphelele Dludla from Business Report. A question to Isabel. How much of the transmission challenges highlighted by the Minister of Electricity are giving you sleepless nights? Mr. Ramukupa says the biggest risk to any remote possibility of a grid collapse is not on the generation side, but on the transmission side, and estimated that it will cost in excess of 200 billion to upgrade the transmission grid. The anonymous attendee again, what is the immediate outlook on load shedding in the coming months? Will we be moving to higher stages with spring approaching? Carol Payton again from News 24. This time the question is directed to Mr. Padayachi. What will stage 9 to 16 look like, for example? How many hours? At what stage does the SO switch off entire towns? Crescent Mushwana, question to Eskom. At what percentage share of variable renewables will the VRE pose a risk to system stability for the Eskom grid? Clement Mushwana again, question to Eskom again. When BPC had a national blackout recently, that is in May 2023, it was mentioned in the media that Eskom assisted BPC to blackstart their system. Do you have insights on how the blackout event happened and how Eskom assisted? Let's go to Paul again from City Power. Are there any plans to keep any of the alternators at the stations due to be decommissioned in service as synchronous compensation units? Joachim Olivier, great work by CSIR. Please share links to research. Joachim again, please also share link to recording of this meeting, which we will. Duplessis CJ says, CJ, what is the main difference between the current stage 1 to 8 and the new proposed stage 1 to 16? Anonymous attendee, what is the name of the modeling software? Is the software the input assumptions and scenarios in the public domain? If so, where could this be found? Anonymous attendee, good morning. Thank you to all presenters for the highly informative session. I would like to inquire from the CSIR team, what will the impact of nuclear power be on grid stability, which has base load and load following capabilities? Considering that Kuberg provides a more reliable source of power, perhaps a business case can be built for the next revised IRP. Prathaban Moodley, the IRP plans for other dispatchable generation sources. This will assist with dispatchable energy. Should these generation technologies not be commissioned, what grid risk results? Anonymous attendee, is the modeling focused on TX only or both TX and DX grids? Anonymous attendee, if Eskom decommissions some of the older power stations, can't we keep the generator motor running without the boilers, etc., to act as a flywheel to maintain system inertia? I think they say Monique Leroux would like to answer these questions. Thank you very much, Monique. Narisa Subramani, for Isabel Fick, you mentioned that it will take 6 to 14 days to bring the grid back up. How much would it cost to come out of the unlikely event of a national blackout? Narisa Subramani from the Citizen newspaper. Greg Mokel, how much capacity and energy or average annual capacity factor would be required from BESS and or gas to power for the integration of 50 to 60 gigawatt of VRE in the opinion of Isabel Fick? And yes, those are the questions that we have on the platform. I would then request the panelists to start getting into them. I'm not sure who are we starting with, or maybe should we start with Monique, because I see you have already indicated that you will want to answer one of the questions posed. Then we'll go to Isabel. Monique.
Thank you, William. Yes, I'm happy to answer. I just want to scroll down. Okay, the modeling software is called Dig Silent Power Factory software. It's German software that's been used extensively in South Africa and all over the world, but unfortunately, this software is not, the software is in the public domain, but the models that we use are not in the public domain. So unfortunately, those can't be shared due to confidentiality issues in the models themselves. So these are mostly only used by Eskom and ourselves. Yes, so unfortunately those can't be shared. Just the next question on nuclear and Coburg. We have modeled the system without Coburg, and I can confirm that the system is able to run stably as it is now, and with even higher penetrations of renewable energy without Coburg. Obviously, Coburg does provide a lot of stability to the Western Cape grid specifically, which is quite unstable, could be unstable at times if the renewable energy penetration increases in the Western Cape specifically. But as I said, there are measures that can be put in place. There are mitigation strategies that can compensate for that. Probably most notably would be the implementation of synchronous generators or other dispatchable generators in the Western Cape, for instance, gas or BESS, battery energy storage. So it isn't that the system can't be operated without Coburg. Maybe Isabel would like to add to that, but our studies have shown, and the previous studies that I showed does indicate, we did take a trip of Coburg into account, and the system can be run stably without that. Obviously, it does provide some nice baseload power in the Western Cape, which does make it more stable. Prathaban's question, the ILP plans for other dispatchable generation sources that will assist with dispatchable energy. What are the risks to the system? Yes, it's difficult to answer because it is going to depend where the system or what the energy mix looks like in future. And I know Eskom has also done quite a lot of modeling into high penetration levels of renewables into the system, upwards of 20 gigawatts and more. And the system can be run stably with that level of renewables into the system. But if you had other dispatchable generators like gas power or battery energy systems connected to the network, that would assist with stability on the grid. And yeah, I think without those, there is definitely a risk to the system if you only had renewable energy generators and high increased levels of renewables onto the grid. So as that level increases, you are going to have to look at mitigation strategies, whether that is from other dispatchable generator units or from synchronous condensers or battery on the system. That's definitely necessary to keep the system stable. Is the modeling focused on TX only or both TX and DX? If we look at stability studies, that's mostly only done at transmission level, because that's where you mostly see your instability quicker. We have started together with Eskom to look at distribution systems specifically, because we're seeing high amounts of renewable generators connected to the distribution systems. I think at the level where it is now, there isn't really a risk at the moment on distribution of any instability, but this can become an issue as the level of renewable generators on the distribution system specifically increases. I think that was probably the only questions. I'm just trying to look that was addressed to me. Thanks, William. If there's something else, I can address that as well, but I think I have captured the ones that were directed.
Thank you very much, Monique. Maybe for housekeeping, I'll indicate that if there are any questions that will be directed to one of the panelists offline, we are available. We'll provide number. Let me take on Ms. Isabel Fick to respond to most of the questions that have been put here. I see you have a basket full, Isabel.
Yes, I'll do my best, and I'll have a bit of a rally on this side. Let me start with a question around 2 cubics being off. In fact, we have had both units off on the 15th of April this year, and that was for about a 48-hour period. There's quite a bit of stability in the Western Cape grid, even without the cubic units, and mainly due to the 765 kV backbone network that is going into that area. So we don't foresee a major issue as a result. You'd need an extra contingency as in a 765 to go down before you'll see a major issue there. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the questions quick as I have them here. Paul, you were asking about the under-frequency load shedding testing. We test our relays every 5 years. Every time they operate, we, however, do an audit to make sure that they've operated correctly and that everything was functioning fine. So you can also add that. And something that really worked for us very well is that we shed in very small blocks so that we can contain the effects thereof. And then lastly, what is also assisted is that our instantaneous demand response contracted program has contributed tremendously for us not to have many of these events. So you're more than welcome to contact our team and we can get into detail with that with you. Sipolele, you were asking about what keeps me awake at night in terms of the TDP, the 200 billion rand investment that the minister was talking about. I'm very confident that also keeping in mind that the TDP is aimed at strengthening the grid for connecting more renewable energy to the grid. It is not a question that the transmission grid is in any bad shape. We do regular maintenance. Our maintenance is around 98% at this stage, so we're doing very well on that front and functioning well. We also monitor our equipment when they operate. So in cases where equipment operates more often, like with load shedding, we do maintenance at more frequent intervals so that we protect the national grid. So no, from a TDP perspective, I do not have sleepless nights. Also, just we have changed our contracting methodology to ensure that the TDP can be executed in the right time frames. We will be looking at a EPC model as opposed to trying to do all of it in-house, which should then also speed up quite a bit of the contracting and procurement of the equipment. Maybe just for the more technocrats out there, the TDP, big chunk thereof is about transformation and bringing in more transformers, more so than just building the lines and substations. Okay, then also in terms of, Crescent, you were asking a question around the frequency and the stability in terms of bringing in more renewables, what percentage would then cause instability. It is not a straightforward answer. It depends on where we are with the TDP at that stage and how much extra stability we have built in. Also looking at the other devices, as Monique has explained in the previous answer to the question. We're working very closely with our international counterparts on this front as well, specifically countries like Denmark and Germany, where they have up to 67% penetration of renewables on their networks and still keeping it stable. So we are not foreseeing a major problem there, and we are doing a lot of work in the background, as Monique has said, looking at synchronous condensers and a number of other devices. Chris and you were asking about the BPC blackout. In fact, there were 2 blackouts during May, not just one, and we insisted in both cases with around 150 megawatts. And what was the cause of the failure? It was a line fault between the generators and the load center, which then effectively disconnected the generators from the load center. So that is what happened there. And then there was a number of cascading trips that followed because of the instability on the network. Anonymous, you were asking about elections and load shedding, and would we not be shedding as a result? And the answer is no. We will always do the load shedding to stabilize the network. The stability of the network is our #1 concern, and we will keep that stable at all times, even if we do have to increase stages of load shedding, as I've mentioned. In terms of exemptions of load shedding, NRS 049, as Vali has actually discussed with you, dictates that it has to be done on an equitable basis. There are some exemptions or possibilities for special events that we can consider, but we can only do so if the network allows. If it does not allow, we will load shed to whatever level we need to keep the network stable. You were asking Anonymous, also, and I'm not sure if it's the same Anonymous, in terms of the recovery process, what is done, and also with regards to communication systems, we are discussing many or our plans as much in detail as we can. However, with different role players, we've been talking to the financial sector, we've been talking to some of the communication sector. There's a lot of work happening in many spheres around the country looking at this problem, and we also have the NatJoints bringing all of this together. So there's a lot of work happening that is not just Eskom based, and also looking at all the other aspects of such an event. One of the questions, what about nuclear? Should we bring in more nuclear? I would love any nuclear I can get, quite honestly, from a system operator perspective, but it is a policy decision and therefore lies with DMRE and not with Eskom. So I really can't comment thereof. Question on the immediate outlook coming of spring and load shedding. It's a very difficult question to answer. We do a weekly outlook plan in terms of the load shedding, a 7-day basis, because it really depends on what's happening on the network at a time. In general terms, I can tell you that in the summer periods, we do more maintenance on the generators, and therefore the network will be more constrained, and you can expect some increase in load shedding. In terms of the level of load shedding, I cannot predict that at this stage. As I said, we do it on a 7-day basis. In fact, our forecasting is done on a minute-to-minute basis, and there's various stages and a whole bunch of mathematical models running in the background to do that for us. But in general terms, summertime, more maintenance, more constrained network. Paul, you were asking if we should keep the old generators as ECO units. Yes, we are definitely looking into that as part of the JET program. ECO units, flywheels, to look at inertia. Yes, we are. That's part of the studies that is ongoing at the moment. Then we also had a question around, should we keep the generators going in terms of the cold fleet? Answer to that is the Generation 2035 strategic plan is being re-looked at the moment to try and optimize the lifespan of these units and keep as many units on the system as long as we possibly can without jeopardizing the system. And Narissa, you were asking about 6 to 14 days recovery time and how much it would cost. This is a very difficult question to answer because it really depends on the time and the industries and how the actual event will play out. So unfortunately, I can't give you a costing answer on that because I really do not know. Craig, you were also asking then in terms of the annual capacity factor for battery storage. At this point, and what would be the required capacity for that, as well as natural gas. At this point, I can do with any battery storage or natural gas. Just also noting that the size of batteries really is very small in comparison to the overall network status, and you would typically find them connected, embedded in the distribution system, and therefore we will basically see them as an offset to the total load, more so than a generator per se. Also looking at ancillary services, that you can expect that we will be going out on a standard offer a bit later in the year. We are working on that, finalizing the budgets and so forth. So that will be coming out in a couple of months as well, to look at what we can do in that front. And then just a little bit tongue in the cheek, Mr. Dupree, I really love your comment around the family meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Let me invite Vali.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just add to some of the comments that the previous speakers had done. I just want to add to the comment that Isabel made about about being pressurized not to load shed. I think that possibility is probably technically minimal, because if I draw an analogy with the pilot of an aircraft, it's like asking the pilot or wanting to instruct the pilot that to take some action which could lead to the plane crashing. So I know it's probably a tough analogy, but it's very close to that analogy. So I don't see that happening, and for two other reasons. I think the fantastic people working in system operation and the various distribution centers are professional people, and when in an emergency, emphasis on emergency, they will take the appropriate action to, in this case, to prevent the grid from going into a blackout and a total grid collapse. So that's from the professionalism point of view. The other one is that we must not forget that in this case, edition 2 and hopefully edition 3, NRS 048.9 will become license conditions for the electricity utilities, meaning ESCOM and the municipalities. So in an unlikely event where they will want to exercise the choice of not doing so, they will be compelled by legislation to act in a manner that brings about compliance. So yes, I make the point that the possibility of being pressurized not to load shed is a very minimal possibility. The other point, Carol Payton raised it specifically to me, where she wanted, if I had to distill the question, the extent of what load shedding would look like between stage 9 and say stage 16. So from an NRS perspective, and I'll comment in respect of edition 3. So in terms of edition 3, in terms of the planning, and yeah, I'm being transparent, because you'll see it when NESA puts the document out for public comment, that stage 9 essentially would reflect 18 hours of load shedding in a 32-hour cycle. So it's 18 hours of load shedding in a 32-hour cycle. And then if you go on to the unlikely event of stage 16, it would reflect 24 hours of load shedding in a 32 in a 32-hour cycle. Okay, so it's stage 16, 24-hour load shedding in a 32-hour cycle. And then one final point, there was another question from one of the persons on the platform to reflect on between stages 1 and stage 16. So I've commented on that as the stages would increase, the hours of load shedding would also increase, as I said to you, 24 hours in 32-hour cycle, stage 16. And but from stage 1 to stage 4, it will be around the 2-hour per stage load shedding. Now, very importantly, and I must mention this, beyond stage 4, what we found is that, which the public don't know this really in the background, that when you get beyond stage 4, you need to, in very simple public language, you need to switch off or do switching in more substations than, say, in lower stages. And so and to do that, you need highly qualified electricians, where if there's no SCADA facility available, then you need these electricians to go and do the switching manually. And for that, you need time, right? And as I said, if you go increase load shedding, you need more substations to be switched on or separately. So to give those highly qualified electricians time to move from a substation to another substation, because these resources are not easy to come by. They're very few and far between, especially in municipalities. The hours of load shedding between the load shedding stages, if I can call it, beyond stage 4, the time increases. So hence, the load shedding beyond stage 4 up to stage 16, the time actually increases, so that inter alia it gives these highly resourced or competent resources time to manually do the switching. And just to add to Isabel's point about Paul's UFLS and Black Start and all of that, there's a requirement in terms of the grid code, also NRS 048 Part 9, that those initiatives are done regularly. And as an NRS association, especially in the last year, we've been in very close contact with the system operator and national control. So we are very, very comfortable that those actions are taking place, and the risk of a blackout or a grid collapse because of those is absolutely minimized. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Vali. My dear panelists and attendees, I think time is no longer on our side. Then allow me to call upon Professor Jan de Kock to make his closing remarks. And from there on, I think we will adjourn the webinar. Prof.
Thank you, William. I'd like to come back to the question about the grid being the cause of blackouts. What we've seen in South Africa over the last 60 years is that that has not been the case. Blackouts have primarily been triggered by grid events, but actually be caused by units at power stations tripping and therefore reducing the total load or the total generating capacity that triggers grid collapse. Then, just to answer Paul's question, question, under frequency testing of relays is very complex, and you need detailed models to simulate that and then inject relays to see their response. In conclusion, I think it's fair to say that it's highly unlikely that we'll have a total grid collapse in South Africa. We can't say it'll never happen, but it's really unlikely, and our grid at this stage is well managed. And we have excellent people investigating causes of small disturbances, multiple unit trips, and in the process, we're actually improving grid performance nearly on a daily basis. And with that, William, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you very much to the insightful information that we shared. It will obviously help to put things into context, but also allay the unnecessary the fears that might be. However, the good thing is that there is no harm in planning for an event that may not happen. It is good to put your systems in place, and as normal, we planned for in case there is that eventuality, but that doesn't mean that is going to happen. And I think the panelists have put in that into context and explained that to us. Let me take this opportunity again to apologize for the override in terms of the time that we allocated, but it was worth it. And as GCIS, we have also led from the comments that have been sent to say perhaps we should do more of this, especially from the experts. And we will, of course, evaluate the session going forward. And the video is available on the contacts of the GCIS. But for a quick contact, those who might want to give a call, Josias is just around his handy on 072-687-1162. I got request that they will want somebody that they can quickly give a call. Is Josias 072-687-1162. But also it will be available on the platforms of GCIS. On that note, thank you very much. This session is adjourned.
Thank you very much, everybody.